Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, Battle for the Bull Market Support Band. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. The last several months have more or less gone as we generally outlined on this channel. And of course, I say that as someone who knows what it's like to be completely humbled by the market multiple times. But we talked a lot back in February, March timeframe of the idea of Bitcoin putting in sort of a local top back in March, 1 month before the halving, just like ETH did 1 month before the merge, setting a few lower highs just when everyone is super bullish and screaming to the moon, and going into a summer lull. Now, we are at a very important point right now. If we were to overlay different moving averages, you can actually tell a lot of different narratives to sort of support the current price action. And to be completely honest, I feel somewhat torn. I will say my general strategy, as I've tried to be fairly open with what I'm doing, at least as it pertains to Bitcoin on here, is I've essentially kept my crypto portfolio Bitcoin heavy for the last 3.5 years, right? Now, it is true back in, 2019, 2020, 2021, I was more so involved in the altcoin market, but seeing tighter monetary policy coming starting in 2022, I just decided I'd rather stick with Bitcoin for a while, no matter the ups or downs. And so far, I mean, right now it's of course worked out. There certainly were periods where it didn't, but it has worked out relatively well so far. And one of the things that I think is interesting is what's really going to happen over the next 2 to 3 weeks. And where we are right now is a very critical spot in terms of what lies ahead. The thing that I will continue to reiterate, if Bitcoin can reclaim its 20-week moving average and hold it as support, then generally speaking, it would favor a further rally. Okay? That is what it would generally favor. Actually, in 2021, I said something very similar. I said if we can hold the 20-week SMA, we should have clear skies ahead. And we did for a little while. We did put in a new all-time high, but it was only a slightly higher high. And then we, of course, came back down. So I would say, as it relates to right now, I mean, we're not at this point, right? This was after we had broken through, and then we came back down and held it as support. We haven't even broken through yet, right? We haven't even broken through yet. That would be the next step, though, if we're going to watch Bitcoin continue to emulate post halving year returns. And the reason we talk about those post halving year returns, and I've said this a few times, is because last year looked a lot more like halving year returns. Now, what's interesting about post halving years is every single one of them had this sort of lull in the summer months. If you go back to 2021, you'll see we had a lull right there. If you go back to 2017, we had a pretty big pullback into the summer right here, right? That was into July. And then in 2013, we had a pretty big pullback into actually slightly below the 20-week moving average. Now, what's interesting is the comparison between where we are right now and 2013. But also, I've talked a little bit about 2019 as well. Again, I will reiterate, I don't think it's going to play out like either one of those, but I do think we can learn some from both of those examples. If you look at what happened by Bitcoin in 2013, we had a pullback that bottomed out on July 5th, which is what exactly happened in 2024. And then the following week, we got back above the 21-week EMA, right? Just the following week. Now, in 2024, we've done something very similar, although technically speaking, we have not had a weekly close above the 21-week EMA yet, because last week, unfortunately, closed just below the 21-week EMA. So the question now is, can we actually close above it this week or not? Now, furthermore, what's more interesting than just the 21-week EMA is also the 20-week SMA. Because if you look at 2013, what happened is we wicked above the 20-week SMA a couple of times, just like we just did. But then ultimately it took about a month to get back above it. And you can see that back in 2013, we were also generally setting a series of lower highs as well. We slowly worked our way back above the 20-week moving average by August, came back down, held it as support in September, and then we had a Q4 rally, right? And this is why I said back in March and April, when so many were so convinced that we were going to, blast off right at the halving, that look, we do need some time to sort of digest this move. And it's normal, right? I mean, it's just what you normally see after Bitcoin has those fairly explosive rallies. And in fact, if you look at when some of these rallies previously occurred, like this one that led into that 2013 peak, I mean, it really got going. You can see right here, it really got this next move that started in October or so of the pre-halving year. The pre-halving year. And you could also find similar things back in 2016, right? You can see a move started here in October of the halving year, and then we had a pullback into that summer. So I think the thing that's interesting right now to me is, does this play out like 2013, 2017, and 2021? And just to give you a little bit more insight into that, if you were to go look at year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin back in 2017, 2021, and 2013, you can see that in all of them, they had this lull going into the summer where the market just kind of sold off, people gave up, and then it started to pick back up in the August to September timeframe, right? You see that? And if you look at 2024, I mean, you can see that so far it's actually no different. Let me hide the 2013 one just because it takes up a lot of real estate there. But if you just look at 2014 compared to 2017 and 2021, we're actually right in between those two. You see that? We're right in between. And we showed this before. If you average out 2017 and 2021, you get something that looks like this. And then if you compare that to 2024, you can see that it's not really that different so far. Now, it's a market, and there's no such thing as a sure thing in the market, right? We cannot look at 2013 and say, well, it has to play out like that, because there's also this reality that when this happened, it happened in a post-halving year, and that's not where we are right now. So there is a possibility where we still get this move, but maybe it doesn't happen until, say, next year, right? Now, I know that's not going to be the most favorite outcome by a lot of market participants, but it is something we should think about. And the only reason I bring it up, right? And I mean, look, guys, I struggle with this myself because I think it's one of those things where it's like your mind is telling you one thing, your heart's telling you something else. But in 2019, it looked like we were probably gearing up for sort of a shorter, sort of a left translated peak, and then the market just kind of sold off into those rate cuts, right? And so while I think comparing this move to 2013 is valid, and comparing it to 2021 is valid, and we should focus on that, especially if we can get back above the 20-week moving average. It still is valid to compare it to the 2019 move. Now, I do think there's a lot of validity to the idea of these cycles that take place over 4 years. I really do. We've seen it happen time and time again. That doesn't mean that the peak has to always occur at the same point, but the last several cycles we did see the peak come in Q4 of the post-halving year, which is still about a year and a half from now, right? So then the question is, do you get something like this sort of in the middle of this cycle, just like we did last cycle? Does something like that happen? Because that's what happened last cycle. And, of course, we could make the claim that it's not going to, but at least up until this point, we haven't seen a real deviation. We haven't. Now, where a deviation could occur would be right now, right? So that's why it seems like the next week or so could be very much instrumental in helping us to identify what happens with Bitcoin in the fourth quarter of the year. Now, if you look at this closely, what you'll see with the 2019 comparison is you'll see very similar things, right? You'll see highs and lower highs, right? You'll see that that's sort of playing out in a very similar fashion, and you'll see your move below the 20-week SMA, just like we got right here, right? The difference between 2013 and 2019 was that in 2013, Bitcoin reclaimed its 20-week moving average by August, right? By August, it reclaimed the 20-week moving average. So within about a month or so. But in 2019, it got rejected after it wicked above its bull market support band, right? You see that? It wicked above the 20-week moving average, and then it got rejected, and then it put in a slightly lower low, okay? Now, when I talk about the 2019 comparison, I'm not talking about this move. I'm not. This is what happened in 2020, not 2019. When we were talking about the 2019 comparison, it was always the idea of a high, a lower high, a lower high over 3 months, followed by a drop beneath the 20-week moving average, right? That's what it was. And if it follows the 2019 move in its entirety, then it would mean one more slightly lower low. That's what it would mean. Now, we don't have to get it. And again, if you look at 2013, we did not get a lower low. The low that occurred on July 5th in 2013 was the low, right? That was the low for the rest of the year. And so there's a chance that the same thing could just have occurred for Bitcoin at the low that we just saw. But this is the comparison, right? And you can even see I was playing around. What I was actually looking at, I was looking at the 36-month moving average for the unemployment rate, because if you look at like the unemployment rate and you look at the 36-month moving average, historically, when you go above it, it means that the unemployment rate just kind of continues to go up for a while, right? I mean, you can see that that's what was going on. And this is one of those things where it kind of goes back to what I've been saying for the last 3 years, right? I don't know exactly where the price of Bitcoin is going to go, right? I don't. I do think, for me, it has made sense to have exposure to Bitcoin over the last several years because it gives me exposure to the upside, minimizes my downside risk, and the Bitcoin dominance is likely going higher as it reclaims more of that market share. But when I was looking at the unemployment rate 36-month moving average, I just happened to switch it over to Bitcoin, and I was looking at this. And so here is a comparison that you can still see has played out, and that's this move to the highs, and then this capitulation below the 20-week moving average to the 36-week SMA, the same spot we just went to with Bitcoin. And following that capitulation to the 36-week SMA in 2019, we wicked above the 20-week moving average, right? Which, if you look closely, is something that just happened, right? We just wicked above it right at that 20-week SMA. You see that? How we wicked right above the 20-week moving average, just like we did in 2019, right? But one of the differences between this move and 2019 is in 2019, we actually spent some time consolidating at that level before getting that rally back up, whereas this time we really didn't, right? We just kind of went down to it and we went straight back up, which is more similar to what happened in 2013, right? Like you get this move to the downside, and then the following week, you just get right back up to the 20-week, to the bull market support band, right? So the quickness of this move seems more reminiscent of what we saw back in 2013 than 2019. But you can see that in 2013, we also did not tag the 36-week SMA. So I still see, some comparisons that are valid. And I've had people ask me, well, how do you... Because, look, guys, if you've been following sort of the business cycle stuff, there's no denying that there's this thing in the back of your mind that's like, well, the Fed hasn't pivoted yet. The unemployment rate's still going up. Is there a chance that this is playing out in a way that's similar to 2019, where you still get another lower low, and then you find out if you have a hard landing or a soft landing, right? That, I think, is kind of the argument to make. In 2019, you could argue that this low right there was the soft landing. And then we ended up getting a hard landing thanks to the pandemic. And back then, we held support right around that 100-week moving average or so. I mean, it was approximately the 100-week moving average. So that would have been somewhat reminiscent, I think, of a soft landing, and then the pandemic ended up hitting. But you can see that Bitcoin also started to aggressively move back up, and then essentially what it did is it put in sort of a double top before then selling off. So I look at this now, and this is a very important battle for Bitcoin. I don't think you should go into this assuming you know what's going to happen. I really don't. And again, I say that as someone who has been humbled by the market several times, and I don't want to go into it assuming I know what's going to happen. I think there's this idea where your brain would say, oh no, it's just going to get rejected because, people are losing their jobs, the unemployment rate's going up. Your heart is probably saying, well, no, Bitcoin is the next best thing. It's probably going to keep gaining value. They're never going to stop printing money, so why will Bitcoin ever stop going up? There's competing forces there, right? And that's why, in terms of trying to, navigating markets is really difficult a lot of times because, your brain might tell you one thing, your heart might tell you something else. For me, I just stick to the risk levels, right? I don't really care what all these narratives are. I remember back in March and April saying there's going to be a summer lull, getting mocked for it. And the same people that mocked me then just spent the last several weeks giving you daily updates as to what the German government was doing, rationalizing why Bitcoin didn't break out up here, right? And again, narrative follows price. Price does not follow narrative, okay? You didn't have to have the German government selling for Bitcoin to get a summer lull. I mean, you had summer lulls in many of Bitcoin's years, even when it went up in Q4. So you have to be careful assigning the narrative to it. And I guarantee you that if there were a lower low, if we were to take out this low, then I'm sure there would be a narrative assigned to that as well. Maybe it's the Mount Gox coins. Perhaps it would just be, a pullback by, some of these larger cap tech stocks or something. I don't know. But that's probably would be the narrative if it were to occur. So the next week or so should be instrumental in helping us identify, is it more like 2013 or post halving years, or is it more like 2019 where Bitcoin sort of sold off into rate cuts? But there is one thing to consider as it relates to the 2019 comparison, and that is that Bitcoin actually topped only 1 month before the first rate cut, right? So there is an example where Bitcoin could get another move to a new high, in August, 1 month before a potential rate cut in September. That's also an option. Remember, this cycle should be different than prior cycles. None of the prior cycles have repeated themselves, right? If you looked at 2019 and we're trying to use 2019 to tell you, or if you looked at, say, 2016 and you were looking at this cycle to tell you what was going to happen in 2019, you would have been lost, right? You would have been lost. If you looked at 2013 to tell you what was going to happen in 2015, 2016, you would have been lost. Because over here, you had like a 70-80% pullback in the middle of the bull market, where you didn't get that in 2017 at all. Like the largest drawdowns were like only 30 to 40%, right? So it's kind of interesting. I mean, I don't really think you can use any of these prior cycles to tell you what's going to happen, but it can tell you what could happen, right? This is what's theoretically possible based on what we have previously seen. So with that in mind, if Bitcoin gets above its 20-week moving average, just like 2013, right? If it can slowly grind above that, then it would favor a Q4 rally. If it can hold it as support, which is what it did over here, right? It got above it, it came back down, held it as support in September, and then we had a Q4 rally, right? Same thing here, right? We held support at the 20-week SMA in July, and then we ended up getting a pullback in September, and then we had a Q4 rally. 2021, right? Same thing. We had a low in, June, July. We got above the 20-week SMA, pullback in September. We had a Q4 rally. So we've seen that happen many, many times. Where we didn't see that happen was 2019, right? Where we had a pullback to the 36-week SMA, which is where we are, which is where we just went, a rally back to the 20-week moving average, but then we got rejected, right? We didn't even get the chance to hold it as support because we didn't even get above it. We just went to a new low, right? To a new local low where we took out some of these prior lows, right? You see? So that, I think, is kind of the question here is can we get above it? If we get above it, then the next task would be, do we hold it as support in September? That's what I would argue, right? If we can get above it, the next task would be, do we hold it as support in September? There often is some unfavorable seasonality in September. That doesn't mean every September is going to be unfavorable. In fact, last September, Bitcoin actually went up during the month of September. It wasn't even a red month. I mean, it's not like price did a whole lot, but it was not a bad month, right? We actually had a sell-off in August, and then in September, we slowly worked our way back up. So I've also said, too, that if you compare this just to last year, there are similarities, right? Local top in April, local top in March, right? Another rally in the summer, another rally in the summer. This rally here started in June. This one there started in late April, early May. So it's kind of shifted by 1 month. The drop below the 20-week SMA back last year was in August. This drop started in July, right? We got it in below the bull market support band in July. We rallied back up to the bull market support band with a weekly close, with just a wick in August, right? Which is now potentially where we are, right? Because now we're in July and we're back up to the 20-week moving average. The question is do we hold it? Do we get back above it? Or do we come back down and test that trend line? One of the trend lines that we talked about, and we actually did this pretty much on the day or within a couple of days of tagging it, was this trend line right here. You see that trend line? Bitcoin's been holding that as support. It's also been holding this as resistance. I don't know how you want to draw it, whether you sort of draw it like that or whatever, but it's been holding, maybe draw it as a parallel channel just and then connect the dots at the lows is perhaps the way to do it. Right here. So we'll draw this parallel channel and they'll just go up. Say, all right, well, what if we're in this parallel channel right here? Right. Some might call it a bull flag, right? Some might call it a bull flag. And we actually had something similar in 2019 as well. If you look at 2019, you could see that arguably, right, we had something very, very similar. Maybe I need to fix how I draw that, but you can kind of see it, right? You have sort of a low, lower low, lower low, right? You kind of kept coming down to that near the bottom of the channel. And you also were setting highs at the top of the channel. You see? And then eventually, we broke out of it. You see? Eventually, we broke out of it. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and the rest is history, right? But that's ultimately what happened. So, if you look at a very similar thing over here, it's kind of a similar thing, but the angle of descent isn't quite as steep, right? Over here, the angle of descent was a lot steeper. Here, it's not as steep. There's less volatility, you could argue. Because, I mean, the moves over here were much more intense. You know, like the rally from that low right there to the top of the channel was like 45%. If you look at the rally that we just had from this low to back up near the top of the channel, it's about 24%, right? 24, 25%. So slightly different. Less volatility, arguably, this cycle than what we saw last cycle. But those are, I think, the similarities to at least talk about. So listen, we talked a lot about this entire move. We outlined it, I would like to think, about as accurately as we could. And look, guys, I've been on the wrong side of the market multiple times throughout the years. And one of the things I'd like to say is that, you know, we talked a lot about back over here, going below the 8-week SMA, wicking down to the 20-week moving average, getting a move off of it. That's what normally happens. Back above the 8-week SMA, going back below it, falling below the 20-week moving average, getting a bounce after that drop to the 20-week SMA. We talked about this a lot, right? We talked about this a lot. And one of the ways we talked about this was looking at like the relative strength index and just saying, look, guys, this is exactly where we got bounces last year off the weekly RSI and even in 2019, right? Even in 2019. So it would make sense to assume that we're going to go back to the 20-week moving average, right? We said this just a couple of weeks ago. So I'd like to think that I've done a pretty good job of outlining this move, especially after getting my face ripped off with this one. And I've tried to become more open-minded to these outcomes. I think again, it's sort of just the market humbling me. I just think the next step is what happens here, because the 8-week SMA is at 63,903. So we're slightly above it, right? Let's just call it 64K, right? Approximately 64K. That's where the 8-week SMA is. We're slightly above it. We just wicked above the 20-week moving average. If you look at 2013, what happened? We wicked to the 20-week SMA and above the 8-week, but then we closed below it. But then the following week, we got above it, right? The week of July 22nd, which would be next week, we got above the 8-week moving average. That would be next week. In 2019, very similar thing, right? Got above the 8-week SMA with a wick all the way up, weekly close above it, and then we just kind of faded back down to a slightly lower low. So, again, if you're looking to me to tell you what's going to happen, you're at the wrong spot. I've told you guys before, my strategy, buy and sell according to the risk levels, ignore everything else. And it's interesting because if you look at a lot of these, a lot of the different things like the fear and greed index, we went to some pretty low levels not that long ago. I mean, now we're all the way back up to fear and greed of 69. We just went all the way down to like 25, which is basically the lowest it had been, even lower than what we saw in 2023. It was lower than what we saw in 2023. It's kind of interesting. And if you look at something like the stablecoin supply ratio oscillator, the spot that we just bounced off of was the same spot we bounced off of in 2023. You see that? That was basically the same spot. So this has been one really interesting move for Bitcoin. And again, I would always say, hope for the best, plan for the worst. Hope that Bitcoin gets back above its weekly 20-week SMA. And hopefully it holds it as support and we can get a rally into the end of the year. If it doesn't happen, make sure you have a plan to account for, if it does go lower again, how you could take advantage of something like that. So that is all I would say about this whole move. I do think this is a pretty intense battle with the 20-week moving average. This is where both sides are going to do the best they can to, if you're a bull, you're going to want to get us through the 20-week. Obviously, if you're a bear, you're going to want to hold as resistance. I will say I'm just going to be over here respecting what happens and going from there. If it plays out like 2019 and it's just a wick above it and then we just fade back down like this, then I'll say, all right, it's 2019. It's just the same thing. If we can get back above the 20-week SMA like 2013, then it would then favor a further rally, right? It's all very familiar. It just depends on what your bias is, The thing is even the 2019 thing, I mean, back in March when we talked about this 2019 comparison, which has mostly played out, right? I mean, I'm sure there's someone out there that would say that it was not a valid comparison. But look, I mean, it's all but played out at this point. All these highs and lower highs, followed by a drop below the 20-week moving average. It all but played out. The only other thing that happened in 2019 was just one more lower low, which again, I've said before, you should not expect it to play out in the exact same way. It might. It also might just be a different path because it's not 2019 and it's not 2013. So this has played out pretty closely. But if you have a problem with the 2019 comparison, I mean, remember, this is what happened the next year, right? So like, let's suppose that we don't see it play out in 2013. Let's suppose you don't get like this rally right here that obviously everyone's wanting. Maybe it just gets delayed until the following year, right? You could have argued that something that happened in 2019 like that, right, where you had this rally, a lot of people were wanting a second rally right here to go to, you know, to much higher highs. We didn't get it, but guess what? We got it the following year. So you could, you know, you certainly could see something like that play out. Got that rally there, and then that one. What's actually another interesting thing to look at is just looking at it in terms of monetary policy. And if you look at it like this, like if you look at interest rates with Bitcoin, one thing I find really interesting is if you look at the pause right here, see where Bitcoin or the Fed paused rates. Bitcoin basically did the same thing after the pause. You see that? What it did was it initially sold off when the Fed paused, right? You see that? And then it had a fairly explosive rally, right? I mean, it's kind of interesting because it really is somewhat similar in the sense that you get a Fed pause and then you get this explosive rally to the upside. Now, back then, obviously, Bitcoin rallied until 1 month before the first rate cut. We're not at the first rate cut yet, and it doesn't look like we're getting a rate cut in July. Unless something major happens in the next 2 weeks, we're probably not going to get a rate cut in July. But we could get one in September. If you look at the September probabilities, let me see. This isn't even loading right now correctly. But if you look at, I believe, if you looked at the September probabilities, the expectation is likely for a rate cut. Right here, you can see it about a 95% chance that they're going to cut to 25 basis points, a 5% chance that they'll be all the way down at 5% by then. So that is something that makes some sense to look at because we know that monetary policy, at least I feel like I know, I could be wrong, but I feel like I know that monetary policy plays a role. I think one way to sort of visualize how monetary policy has played a role and how it is sort of manifesting even if it doesn't seem like it is when you look at something like Bitcoin dominance without stablecoins and you look at 2024. It's been trending up basically all year long, right? You see that? Been trending up. But if you had looked at 2016 and 2020 before 2024 began, you would have looked at this and said that, oh, it's a halving year. Bitcoin dominance is going to go down until the third quarter, right? Wouldn't you have maybe made that assumption? If you had looked at just this chart, 2016 and 2020 Bitcoin dominance excluding stables, you would have just assumed that dominance would probably just sell off until the third quarter and then get another rally back up, but it wouldn't really ever be in an obvious uptrend, right? It might be go down for a while, back up, back down, back up, but you're not really seeing an obvious uptrend. But because of monetary policy, I said, no, this doesn't make that much sense. I think dominance is going to go up in the halving year. And sure enough, you can see a fairly obvious uptrend in dominance that is different than what we saw in the last two halving years, right? I mean, it's pretty clearly different. That doesn't mean there can't be some form of another sort of sell-off and dominance, kind of around the spot ETF approval for Ethereum. And I've said that before. Sort of the weak point would be, you know, the next month or so if it's going to come back down. But you can see that all these other larger drops by dominance in halving years that we saw that in prior halving years, we didn't really see this halving year, right? All the drops that we've had still just led to a higher low. Whereas in prior halving years, a lot of them were leading to lower lows, right? These were lower lows going in. But this year it's been higher lows. So because of monetary policy, Bitcoin has continued to outperform the collective market, right? And so because of that, I think maybe it makes sense to overlay Bitcoin with monetary policy, like with interest rates. And you can see that it actually, I mean, if you take a bar pattern from like right here to this low that was set, and then just take it out sort of through the end of 2019, you'll see it's kind of a very similar move, right? A very, very similar move. The only difference is that this time it's taken a little bit longer for it to play out, which makes sense because the pause has been longer. Last cycle, the pause was only half a year. This cycle, the pause, it's already been a year, right? This July will be 1 year since the Fed paused rates. And all you really have to do is just kind of expand this over and see the similarities. All you have to do is sort of expand that over, and you can see, how it lines up. I think the main difference that could still play out is, does Bitcoin rally into rate cuts like it did in 2019, right? But there's this other thing that I also have in the back of my mind, and I remember from 2019. In June of 2019, the Fed came out at the FOMC and said, look, guys, we're not going to cut rates until next year, until 2020. And then in July, they cut rates. And it was actually in July when Bitcoin rallied. It was a 2-week rally, right? We got a 2-week rally. And so I'm wondering, is the current rally right now that Bitcoin's getting, it's gone on for a couple of weeks now, is it because the market is now convinced? I mean, legitimately, the market says there's a 0% chance of a rate cut, or of no rate cut by September. That's what the market says. So a rate cut is getting fully priced in at this point. You can see that, right? A rate cut is getting fully priced in because the probability of them not cutting by September, according to CME Group, is 0%, which is kind of scary to some degree, because the implication is, well, what happens if you get a hot inflation print between now and then, and then you go from pricing in this rate cut to then having to price it back out? It's kind of a game of chicken with the Fed, right? The Fed wants to cut rates, but then the market front runs it, and then the timing of the first rate cut has just been getting pushed further and further and further out. There's some people out there that say no rate cuts until 2025. In fact, if at the next meeting the Fed came out and said no rate cuts until 2025, that would be akin to what they did in 2019 at the June meeting, where they came out and said no rate cuts until 2025. And when they said that, or until 2020, and when they said that, it was the following month that all Bitcoin pairs broke down, right? And the Bitcoin dominance had its final surge. So I look at it, I'm like, well, do you wait? When Bitcoin had this rally right there, it was when the Fed cut rates. But the Fed did not advertise that rate cut. They, in fact, said we weren't going to have a rate cut. Now we're getting a rally, I think, because we're starting to sniff out those rate cuts. And you really don't even need to look any further than just traditional markets. I mean, look at what the Russell 2000 just did. Did you guys see the Russell this past week? Look at this move, right? Small caps are starting to sniff out some of these rate cuts. In fact, if you were to look at the Russell divided by the NASDAQ, it's had a fairly explosive move. Now, it's not the first time that it's had a move like this back above its 20-week moving average, right? It did something similar back in January. And in fact, I mean, you could argue, right? You could argue that if you connect these dots, it kind of looks like it's rallied back up to the breakdown point. Kind of like over here, right? You can see when it broke down right here, it had this breakdown here, and then it rallied back up to the breakdown point. Same thing just happened. You see the same thing, how the same thing just occurred? And of course, it did go above the bull market support band, just like it did back over here. So I know there's a lot of people thinking that this rotation to small caps is durable, and look, they could be right. But I still think that Bitcoin will reclaim more market share by the end of the year. I really do. I think Bitcoin dominance is poised to continue going higher, because we know last cycle we didn't even see it top until 2 months after the first rate cut. And it also didn't top until QE began, which didn't occur until September of 2019. That still hasn't happened yet. So because of that, I feel compelled, sort of my strongest conviction for the last several years has just been Bitcoin dominance is going to go higher no matter the direction of Bitcoin USD. Now, of course, There's a lot of people that think, well, that means that Bitcoin can only go up or that means it can only go down. No, it's simple. It's, guys, it doesn't matter what way Bitcoin goes. Dominance goes up either way. So we're all investors here, right? I mean, you wouldn't be here if you didn't like taking on some level of risk. That's why I've said Bitcoin gives you exposure to the upside, but it also minimizes your downside risk. Now, that might sound crazy to a lot of people, but if you compare it to the altcoin market, I would say that's true. Now, if you compare it to the S&P, maybe it's not true, right? I mean, certainly Bitcoin can get bigger it's gotten larger drawdowns than what you typically see happen with the S&P 500, but it's still, if you're accepting the risk of crypto to begin with, Bitcoin helps you mitigate that downside risk by having that over, say, a lot of different altcoins. So I think where we are is a very critical juncture right now, in terms of what happens for the rest of the year. And I'm just trying to be upfront with you guys right now. If we get back above the 20-week SMA and hold it as support, then it favors new all-time highs. Right? That's just the reality. If it gets rejected and we start to come back down below the 21-week EMA, then it favors a lower low, right? Again, that's just the reality. You could be on either side of that and not like either of those outcomes, but the secret to investing, be prepared for both, right? Don't worry so much about it. Just be prepared for both. Right? It means having, for me, it means having a Bitcoin position, but also, look, if it continues to drop like 2019, getting some more. So we'll see what happens here at the 20-week moving average. Whether it actually comes back down. I think like one of the differences between 2019 and 2013 is 2013, like it wasn't really setting lower lows and higher and lower highs. It was setting sort of like a higher. It more looked like this, right? It looked more like that. Maybe you could argue it was in that channel if you ignore this April wick. Perhaps you could argue that. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think these are really, really interesting times, for Bitcoin. And if we do get another rally, like if Bitcoin breaks above this channel here, right? So I guess the two different options here. So one path would be sort of coming back down, and then doing something like this. Another path would be you go up, get above it, come back down, hold it as support, right? Around that September timeframe. That would be another path. So this path up here is more so the 2013 path. This path would be more like the 2019 path, where it's like a slightly lower low a couple months later. One interesting thing about this is that I do think there will be a lot of volatility either way. And if you look at like alt Bitcoin pairs, what you'll notice here is that every couple of months we've been putting in a lower low, right? So here you had one in February, and then a lower low in April, and then a lower low in June. So the next one would be due for August. The reason why August is interesting is because last cycle, alt Bitcoin pairs durably broke down in June, 1 month before the first rate cut. Now, the first rate cut back then was July. That's when alt Bitcoin pairs broke down, was in June, 1 month before. And so if you look at it here, you could argue, well, if altcoins are destined to set another lower low 2 months after this low in August, that would be 1 month before when the market at least thinks the next rate cut is going to be in September. So it seems like, I mean, it seems like it's playing out in a similar fashion with monetary policy, but it also seems kind of similar to post halving year returns. And I go back and forth, but look, guys, I think I'm at the point where I don't really care that much. I mean, whatever happens happens. If we get here's the thing about Bitcoin, right? If you get a drawdown, like a larger pullback, you're still you're still made a lot of money, right? I mean, if you've just been sticking with Bitcoin throughout this entire phase, you've still done really, really well, even if it gets a pullback. If you stuck with altcoins, I mean, I'm not saying you're necessarily hurting depending on which altcoin you got, But some of those alts haven't really done that well, right? So it kind of more so depends on which altcoin you got. Whereas with Bitcoin, it was just more obvious, right? With Bitcoin, you just knew more or less that Bitcoin would do pretty well. If crypto does well, it's because Bitcoin's doing well, not the other way around. Whereas with the altcoin market, you had to be able to pick the one that would outperform, and most of them did not. Even though some of them did, most of them did not. So that I think is an interesting comparison. So let's see if it's more like 2013 where you take out these highs, here the next month or two, and then you get a Q4 rally like 2013, 2017, and 2021, or if it ends up playing out like 2019. My guess is that regardless, if it's rejected, if it's rejected, then guess what? Bitcoin dominance goes up. If it breaks new highs, Bitcoin dominance goes up. One other thing before I forget is to look at alt Bitcoin pairs. It is actually kind of similar to what we saw earlier. So if we just overlay really quickly Bitcoin USD onto this chart, so you see how alt Bitcoin pairs have been playing out here. Look at this. You see this low? That occurred on a Bitcoin dump. Okay. So here you had this low on a Bitcoin dump, and then you had this low on this Bitcoin dump. So like basically Bitcoin is putting in these lower highs, and if you compare what was going on into those lower highs, right? Alt Bitcoin pairs were capitulating right there and right there. Right? They were capitulating into those lows as Bitcoin was dumping. And then in April, alt Bitcoin pairs had this rally back up where you kind of had sort of three tops over here. And then those tops occurred as Bitcoin was going back up. You see that? So after the low was set, after the local low was set, alt Bitcoin pairs started to go back up. Right, they started to go back up, and as, or at least not necessarily after the first local low, but we saw alt Bitcoin pairs sell off during a Bitcoin dump as Bitcoin started to get a rally back up to the top of the channel. Right, as that happened, alt Bitcoin pairs were back up here, right, sort of setting this distribution phase. Right, you see alt Bitcoin pairs were sort of distributing back right here as Bitcoin was just churning through this level. And then Bitcoin came back up, reached kind of this upward channel up here. Alt Bitcoin pairs had fallen off and then just consolidated for a little bit, and then they sold off again as Bitcoin came back down, right? So if Bitcoin were to, if it were to play out like what happened last time, right? If you argue that like this move right here is similar to this one, then draw the line, right? Draw the line right here. Right here. Basically, alt Bitcoin pairs had this distribution. They then sold off, consolidated for a few weeks while Bitcoin even went higher back up to the top of the channel, and then they sold off again. So you could argue that alt Bitcoin pairs are repeating, either one of these things, where they're in this sort of this distribution zone, and Bitcoin slowly reclaiming market share. Again, I know it's not a popular theory, guys, but I mean, alt Bitcoin pairs just keep on putting in lower lows, right? You see that? Or sorry, lower highs and lower lows. Now, of course, they'll turn around at some point, but I don't know if they've turned around just yet. I actually think they haven't. So it looks kind of similar, right? These tops that alt Bitcoin pairs go through, and they just sort of distribute out during these ranges that Bitcoin's in, and then they then just collapse to a new low. And you've seen it happen now several times, right? Several times. So that's where we are with the market. Let's see what Bitcoin has in store, if it can get back above its 20-week moving average or not. We should know here within the next couple of weeks. Thank you guys for tuning in. Subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. And again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.